Imagine you are exactly 12 years old. Think about what your life looks like right now. You wake up in a warm bed. You complain about having to go to middle school. Your biggest worries are math tests, video games, and who is sitting next to whom at lunch. You depend entirely on your parents for food, shelter, and protection. Now imagine stripping all of that away. Imagine waking up 10,000 years ago. You are still 12 years old, but you are no longer considered a child. You are an adult. The older members of your tribe are looking at you with heavy expectations. You are expected to hunt, forage, build shelters, and protect the group. And perhaps most shocking of all to our modern minds, you are expected to start a family. Why did ancient humans grow up so incredibly fast? And why did they start having kids when we are just starting 7th grade? To understand this, we have to completely throw away our modern sense of time. Today we view life in distinct, slow phases. We have childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle age, and the senior years. We stretch these phases out because we have the luxury of time. But in the ancient world, time was a luxury no one could afford. Life was compressed. You have probably heard the statistic that the average life expectancy in the ancient world was around 30 years old. This number is a bit tricky. It does not mean everyone dropped dead on their 30th birthday. If you survived early childhood, you could actually live into your 50s or 60s. But that was a very big if. The infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. Because so many children did not make it past their 5th birthday, the overall average life expectancy gets pulled way down. This constant presence of early death created a powerful biological and cultural pressure. There was a desperate rush to sustain the population. You could not afford to spend a decade finding yourself or figuring out your career path. The survival of your bloodline and your entire tribe depended on reproducing as soon as biology allowed. It is a harsh reality that makes us uncomfortable today. But for ancient humans, it was simply the math of survival. Let us look at the first major challenge ancient humans faced. This is the sheer difficulty of keeping a population alive. In our modern world, we expect almost every baby born to grow up. But for all of human history before modern medicine, this was not the case. Archaeologists looking at ancient burial sites consistently find a heartbreaking number of small skeletons. It is estimated that in many early societies, up to half of all children died before they reached puberty. Disease, malnutrition, predators, and harsh weather were constant threats. A simple scratch could become a fatal infection. A bad cold could easily turn into pneumonia. A dry summer could mean widespread starvation. Parents lived with the constant, terrifying knowledge that they could lose their children at any moment. This created a massive problem for the human species. How do you keep a tribe going when half of your future generation will not survive? The answer was to start early and have many children. A woman in the ancient world might need to give birth to 8 or 10 children just to ensure that 2 or 3 survived to adulthood. Childbirth itself was incredibly dangerous. It took a massive toll on the human body. This meant the window for having healthy children was relatively short. Starting the process of reproduction as soon as a young person was biologically capable, around the age of 12 or 13, gave them the maximum amount of time. It gave them the years needed to produce enough children to beat the grim odds of ancient mortality. It was a numbers game played with human lives. The tribe needed numbers to defend territory, hunt large game, and gather enough calories. Every individual was a vital piece of the survival puzzle. Waiting until someone was in their 20s to start contributing to the next generation was a risk no ancient group could take. The mathematics of ancient life demanded absolute speed. This brings us to another incredible challenge. Human babies are uniquely helpless. Think about a baby horse. A baby horse can stand up and run within a few hours of being born. But a human baby cannot even hold its own head up for months. A human child cannot reliably feed itself or walk for years. This is because of our brains. Humans evolved to have massive, highly complex brains. But a fully grown human brain cannot fit through the birth canal. So human babies are born essentially unfinished. Their brains have to do most of their growing outside the body. This means raising a human child requires an unbelievable amount of time, energy, and calories. A human brain uses up to 20% of the body's energy. Growing that brain requires a massive amount of fat and protein. An ancient mother could not gather all that food on her own while also carrying a heavy toddler. Raising a human is arguably the most resource-intensive process in the animal kingdom. How did ancient peoples solve this? They relied on the entire tribe, but especially on the extended family. This leads us to something scientists call the Grandparent Hypothesis. To successfully raise these helpless, large-brained babies, young parents needed help. They needed their own parents to help gather food, watch the children, and share the crushing workload. But remember the life expectancy we talked about earlier. If you wait until you are 25 to have your first child, your own parents might already be dead, or they might be too old and frail to help. But if you have your first child at 13 or 14, your parents are likely only in their late 20s or early 30s. They are in the prime of their lives. They have the strength and energy to help you keep your infant alive. Ancient humans compressed the generations. They had children early. This ensured a strong network of young grandparents. These energetic grandparents were ready to support the incredible burden of raising human offspring. The survival of the baby depended directly on the youth of the grandparents. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved around constantly. In those ancient nomadic societies, having too many children at once was actually a problem because you had to carry them. But then something happened that changed human history forever. We invented farming. Around 12,000 years ago, humans started settling down. They built permanent villages. They planted crops. They domesticated animals. You might think this made life easier, but in many ways it made life much harder. Farming is back-breaking work. It requires endless hours of clearing land, planting seeds, pulling weeds, and harvesting crops. The challenge of the early farmer was a massive labor shortage. There were no machines to do the heavy lifting. The only energy available came from human muscle. How did early agricultural societies solve this labor crisis? They grew their own workforce. Children were no longer just mouths to feed, they were essential farmhands. A child of 5 or 6 could weed a field, chase away birds, or feed animals. By the time they were 12, they could do the work of a full adult. Because farming societies stayed in one place, women could have children much closer together. The cultural pressure to have large families exploded. Marrying young girls off at 12 or 13 became a standard practice in many early agrarian societies. The goal was to maximize the reproductive years to produce as many workers as possible for the family farm. A large family meant wealth and security. A small family meant starvation. This shift from foraging to farming cemented the practice of very early marriage and reproduction. Children were the ultimate economic asset, and you needed to start producing them as soon as humanly possible. Consider another massive challenge of the ancient world. This was the problem of preserving and passing on knowledge. Today, if you want to know how to build something, you look it up on your phone. You have access to the combined knowledge of the entire human race in your pocket. Ancient people had absolutely no written records. They had no books, no internet, and no formal schools. But they needed to know a staggering amount of information just to survive a single year. They had to know which hundreds of plants were safe to eat and which ones would kill them instantly. They had to know how to track migrating herds across vast distances. They had to know how to predict winter storms by looking at the clouds and animal behavior. They had to know the highly technical process of making sharp hunting tools out of stone. How did they transfer all of this critical data to the next generation without a single classroom? The answer is practical. Relentless immersion. Children were not kept separate from adult work. From the moment they could walk, they were placed right in the middle of it. They learned by watching and doing. The human brain is incredibly adaptable, and around the age of 10 or 11, it becomes very good at mastering complex physical and spatial skills. Ancient societies took advantage of this biological window. By the time a person turned 12, they had already spent a decade observing the adults. They had absorbed the essential survival data of their tribe. They were ready to put it into practice. There was no need for a high school diploma because their education was already complete. They were fully qualified for the harsh job of ancient survival. Another aspect we have to consider is social structure. Today, we have a very distinct concept of a teenager. A teenager is someone caught in the middle. They are biologically maturing, but society still treats them somewhat like children. They are not expected to carry the full weight of adult survival. But the concept of the teenager is actually a very modern invention. In the ancient world, the teenage years simply did not exist. There was no holding area between childhood and adulthood. The challenge was that the tribe could not afford passengers. Every person consumed precious food and water. Once you were physically capable of doing adult work, you became an adult. How did they enforce this sudden change? Many ancient cultures developed intense, sometimes painful coming-of-age rituals. These rituals varied wildly across different regions. Some involved fasting in the wilderness for days. Others required the young person to hunt a dangerous animal to prove their bravery. Some involved complex ceremonies with music and permanent body markings, but the end result was always exactly the same. You walked into the ritual as a dependent child. You walked out as a fully responsible adult. The moment a young boy or girl passed puberty, usually around 12 or 13, they went through this transition. Once the ritual was complete, they were full members of the society. They sat by the adult fires. They joined the hunting parties. They were considered ready for marriage and children. There was no psychological space for adolescence. The environment was too harsh to allow for a decade of rebellion, self-discovery, or slow maturation. You were a child one day, and after the ritual, you were expected to behave with the seriousness of someone trying to keep their people alive. To really grasp this, imagine a typical day. You are a 12-year-old girl in an early agricultural settlement. The sun has not even risen yet. You wake up on a hard dirt floor. You are already married. Your family arranged this marriage to a man several years older than you. They did this to share land and resources. You do not go to a kitchen to pour cereal. You immediately walk to the river in the freezing dark. You carry heavy clay pots of water back to the village. The moment you return, you start grinding grain on a large stone. It takes hours of repetitive, exhausting motion. You do this just to make enough flour for the day. Your hands are heavily calloused. Your back constantly aches. There is a baby strapped to your chest. This is your own child. The baby is crying for milk. After baking flatbread over a smoky fire, you walk out to the fields. The sun is blazing hot. You spend the rest of the daylight hours bent over. You pull weeds by hand. You hope the crops survive the season. You watch the sky carefully. A bad storm means your family will starve this winter. As the sun sets, you do not get to relax. You sit by the fire, you spin rough fibers into thread, you repair broken tools. You are exhausted in a way modern teenagers rarely experience. You hold your baby close in the dark. You hope the child survives the fever that has been going around the village. You do not dream about what you want to be when you grow up. You are already grown up. Your only dream is that your family survives until the next harvest. It is important to clarify a biological reality here. We often assume that ancient people matured faster physically, but the evidence actually points in the exact opposite direction. The challenge of ancient diets was that they were often very poor in calories and fat compared to today. How did the human body adapt to constant food scarcity and high physical stress? It actually delayed physical maturation. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers and ancient bones have found that puberty in the deep past often arrived slightly later than it does today. The modern age of puberty has actually dropped due to our rich diets and artificial environments. So the idea that everyone in the ancient world was naturally having kids at exactly 12 is slightly complicated. The physical capability might have arrived a bit later for many, but the cultural expectation was still incredibly early by our standards. As soon as a young person showed the very first signs of physical maturity, the clock started ticking. Whether it was exactly 12 or 13 or 14, the social reality remained the same. The transition was immediate. As soon as you could biologically bear a child or father a child, society demanded that you do so. The harsh conditions of life meant there was no gap between physical ability and social duty. The tribe needed the next generation, and you were the vehicle to provide it. So why did this all change? Why are 12-year-olds today sitting in classrooms instead of raising families? The turning point is not that far in our past. It began with the Industrial Revolution and the incredible leap forward in modern medicine over the last 2 centuries. For the first time in human history, we solved the major problems of early survival. We discovered germ theory, we invented vaccines, we created antibiotics, we developed sanitation systems that gave us clean drinking water. Suddenly, the brutal math of ancient life was broken. Children stopped dying in massive numbers. You no longer needed to have 8 children just to see 2 survive. Most babies born actually grew up. This changed the entire structure of the human family. At the exact same time, the world was becoming vastly more complicated. The economy shifted from simple farming to complex industry. Then it shifted again to technology and information. The new challenge was that surviving in this modern world required completely new skills. It required reading, writing, advanced math, and specialized training. Raw physical strength was no longer the most valuable asset. How did society adapt to this massive shift? We created a buffer zone. Because people were living into their 70s and 80s, we could afford to pause. We could take the first 2 decades of life and dedicate them entirely to learning and growing. We invented the modern school system. We invented the concept of the teenager. We pushed the age of marriage and childbearing back further and further. Raising a successful adult now required years of expensive education, not just a pair of working hands in a field. The biological clock was finally separated from the social clock. The desperate rush to reproduce was replaced by the luxury of time, preparation, and choice. They lived in a world where time was an enemy, constantly threatening to wipe out their families and their future. You live in a world where time is a resource given to you in abundance to learn, play, and discover who you are. They carried the weight of human survival on their small shoulders the moment they could walk. You get to just be a kid. The next time you feel stressed about a math test or frustrated by your parents, remember the 12-year-olds who came before you, because they gave up their childhoods so that thousands of years later you could have yours.